Long time no see. It's been a while since I've been able to have some videos to put up, but I'm going to try and get more in the swing of things and not go so long without posting. I say that, and that may not be true, but it's definitely what I'm hoping to do. I haven't been up to much since I last posted, but I did finally get to take a trip out to San Francisco. I mentioned in my video on Alcatraz that that was one place I've always wanted to visit, and I'm so happy that I finally got to. It was everything I imagined and more. We actually did the behind-the-scenes tour of Alcatraz, which, while it does cost more, was definitely worth the cost. We had the regular self-guided tour, but before that we were walking around with a tour guide who took us to places not seen on the regular tour, and we got a more in-depth look at things. I'll put in as many pictures and videos as I can because I took a lot. So here's a picture as we were approaching the island on the ferry. It was kind of foggy that day, but even so, we could see the island very clearly, and we could even see the Golden Gate Bridge in the background. Right when getting off the ferry, you can see evidence left behind from the United Indians of All Tribes occupation that began in November of 1969. I talked about that and a few other things that we're going to touch on in this video in the last Alcatraz video I did, so I'll link that in case you're wanting to check that out before you get through this one. One thing that I learned on the tour that I don't think I knew beforehand was that this occupation was what actually led to Alcatraz becoming a landmark. Before the occupation, I believe they were actually planning on selling the island and razing everything to the ground. And I think they were going to build like resorts or something. Could you imagine if that actually happened? So the next interesting thing I saw was a plaque reading Alcatraz Island, 1857. I knew it was originally named Alcatraz by Lieutenant Don Juan Manuel de Ayala, but I don't think I knew that the plaque still existed. You hear the pretty complex history where it served different functions over time, but to actually see the different functions laid over top of each other is awesome. The next building we came upon was one that was once like an officer social hall where they'd have like gatherings and meetings and parties, and I think they even had a bowling alley in there, if I'm not mistaken. Now the building is very dilapidated, partly due to a fire that broke out during the occupation of the island. It's actually more like a shell of a building. The tour guide talked a little bit about possible future plans for the island as far as renovations, and the social hall being rebuilt was actually mentioned in there, but I know it's probably not high up considering they do have a lot of other things to do on the island to not only make it safe, but to make other areas accessible as well. I can't remember the exact number he mentioned, but so much has already been put into renovations and upkeep for the island, with the biggest expense mostly being earthquake retrofitting. The actual main prison has been undergoing a huge renovation for a really long time, where they've been retrofitting and renovating the entire outside of it, and it's going to look like it did back in the day. Currently, there are nets surrounding a lot of it because of all the falling debris, which is why they have to renovate it. Now, remember the tunnels I mentioned in that last video? Well, we actually got to walk through one of them. There was actually an entrance leading into the new Industries building that housed the laundry facilities where the inmates worked. They didn't know that that entrance was there because it was walled off, and they only had heard rumors from the time when it was a military prison being passed down to them. Apparently this building was one of the many places where a scene from the movie The Rock was shot. I watched the movie, and while it was really nice to see some of the places in person and be like, yeah, I saw that, was it my favorite movie? No, not really. The tour guide actually told us of an escape attempt that was made here that I hadn't heard of. A lot of laundry that was done in the facilities on Alcatraz Island was for military personnel. This meant that the inmates often had access to and were laundering things like uniforms, military uniforms. So I bet you can see where I'm going with this. In 1945, after spending several years stealing piece by piece, John Giles finally had a full uniform together. Dressed as an Army technical sergeant, he made his way onto an Army launch boat. Within 20 minutes, Giles was caught and he was returned back to the island. I personally think it was an ingenious idea given the circumstances and what he had access to. They also had what I think the tour guide mentioned was the original signage on the island, and it's since been replaced with a new sign. That way that original one doesn't get damaged any further. There were still some places that even we couldn't go because they weren't safe to enter, like the building here called the Model Industries building. This was where workshops and the laundry facilities were before they moved to the new Industries building in 1939. Another that I would have loved to see inside is Building 64, and this served as apartments for military officers, military guards, and their families. While there is a bookstore on the bottom floor, it would have been cool to be able to go inside and see the way that the officers and their families lived, to contrast that to how the prisoners lived. On the way to that building, we also saw the infamous Alcatraz written on the roof, so here's a picture of that too. After seeing all of this, we finally continued our behind-the-scenes tour inside the prison itself. We first saw Cell Block A, and what I didn't know before the tour was that Cell Block A was not renovated when the prison was taken over by the Bureau of Prisons. The other cell blocks were renovated with different cell doors that better prevented escape, but the ones in Cell Block A remain the same, and you can still see that. Another interesting thing we got to see that I also didn't know about were the cells underneath Cell Block A. These are sometimes referred to as the dungeon. These cells were actually remnants from the original fort, and you can see one of the little holes that were built into the wall of the original fort, as well as the crumbling brick earth that shows the island beneath, because this was built right on top of the island and never torn down. These cells were used for the worst of the worst inmates during the time when the prison was used as a military prison, and it was also used some after it became a federal prison until 1938, when it was stopped because of how truly inhumane it was. Before this, men could be kept in there legally for up to 14 days at a time when it was a military prison, and up to 19 days at a time when it was a federal penitentiary, although it seems like this time frame wasn't always followed strictly, and some inmates did end up staying in there longer than they were supposed to. The rooms were small, dark, cold, and completely black. It was solitary confinement of the worst type. They weren't even allowed a bed. And while the doors are no longer on the cells anymore, you can still see remnants of the past carved into the stones. There are tons of inmate numbers scrawled throughout. We next got to go up a floor and see the chapel and also the guards' break room. The break room is obviously run down now, but it isn't hard to imagine how it must have looked back when it was in use. We also got to walk along the catwalks the guards used to keep watch over the cell blocks with rifles. On this walkway, there was also a window into the chapel where the guards would stand watch with a rifle when it was in service. The inmates were told they could not get up while they were in the chapel, and if they did, they would be shot immediately. We were told the story of one inmate who went only once before deciding never to go again because he had a rifle pointed at him during the service. Interestingly enough, also on this walkway, you can see the place where the most famous escape attempt took place. This was the one where John and Clarence Anglin and Frank Morris used those dummy heads, and then they dug holes in their cell, and they escaped through those, and then they got to this spot in the picture. They climbed out onto the roof, and then they climbed down some piping. Normally, it would have been in perfect view from that walkway, as you can see from the pictures. However, the inmates had tarps hung up for painting during the time, allowing them access to the roof unseen. Something we saw on the self-guided tour related to this was Cell Block B, aka Broadway. There's even a clock that is set to Times Square hanging at the end of the block. These were where the cells of the escapees were, and they have them set up to see, which was super creepy to see the heads set up like they would have been for the escape, but it was also really interesting. Also in some of the cells were items that inmates would have had during their time there. One of those items that inmates all had to have was a copy of the institution rules and regulations. Now don't ask me why, but I did buy a copy of it, among a lot of other things, while I was at the gift shop. It has everything imaginable in it, from sections on your daily routine, your privileges, your religious services, to sections on contraband, bribing guards, or threatening people. I'll include some pictures of the regulation book from online, and that'll be linked down below as well in case you want to go through the whole thing. One of the pages I found the most interesting was a page detailing the cell. It was a diagram of where everything would go, and the manual even tells inmates how to set up their pillow and their bed, and what to do with their extra blankets. It's a very detailed instruction manual. After seeing the walkway on the behind the scenes tour, we talked more about the cells themselves, and the tour guide even went up to the second row of cells to show us them in operation. Not all of the mechanics that work the cells are still in operation for each of the different cell blocks and each of the different floors, because they did have to take parts from some of them to keep just a few of them operational. This was really interesting to see in practice, so I'll insert that video here. A little warning, the clip is a little bit loud.
All right, let's lock door one, maybe door one, maybe he's got a visitor. Second number unlocks it. Third number opens it. I can open one door and shut another one. it's over for number 1 and maybe number 2. Or you can open all of it at once. Like mealtime, 7 a.m. breakfast in the dining hall.
The last stop on the behind the scenes portion of the tour was the hospital wing. We got to see a room where an operating table and an overhead light were. And while the table isn't original to the prison, the overhead light actually is. We also got to see the pharmacy, and that's where some more scenes from The Rock were shot. After that was the x-ray room and the dark room. I believe that the tour guide said the x-ray table is actually original to the prison. This wing is where I learned another thing that I never knew but really should have known. We were in a room where different therapies were done, like physical, occupation, or hydrotherapy. We were told that the bath that was used for hydrotherapy was actually where one of the inmates, Robert Birdman Stroud, took one bath a week because he had been moved to his own private cell in the hospital wing. We were told that one day Birdman decided that he was going to convince everyone in the cell block to go into complete chaos in their cells. After that, it was decided that he had to be where absolutely no other prisoners could even hear him, and that place ended up being a cell in the hospital wing, directly across from where he'd take his weekly baths. Turns out, he was also very sick, so this did work out for him. Also in the hospital wing were 2 rows of 6 to 8 cells total, where inmates who were sick or recovering could be housed. It was mentioned that Al Capone would have spent a lot of time in these cells during the latter part of his time on Alcatraz. The few other places I wanted to mention that were on the self-guided tour were the intake area, the library, the dining hall, and the recreation yard. While the library held all of the books that the inmates could check out, I don't think any inmates were actually regularly allowed in there. The books they wanted to read were brought to their cells, and the books that were in the library excluded tons of topics, so anything that included violence, drugs, murder, sex, etc., they weren't in there. The dining hall was also interesting to see because it isn't as big as you think, considering how many inmates would be there at one time. However, it is also a lot of area to cover when there are that many inmates in close quarters. While in there, I took a couple pictures of the menu board and the kitchen area, so those are included in here as well. Newer to Alcatraz, and the last thing that we saw there was an exhibit called the Big Lockup. I actually saw something very similar at Eastern State Penitentiary, and it's something that I wish more people saw. During this, I've also included some photos from that site because I didn't take a lot while I was in there. The exhibit is focused on the history and present state of incarceration in the US. I'm going to quote this next part from a site that I've also linked below, explaining the exhibit because it words it perfectly and concisely. The exhibit features infographics explaining how the war on drugs and systemic racism has disproportionately incarcerated people of color, as well as panels describing how education, affluence, drug use, and whether or not someone is placed in foster care can influence the likelihood that someone is incarcerated. For more context, the US has the largest prison system in the world with over 2.3 million people. 1 in 37 adults in the US are in prison or in jail, or on probation or parole, making it the country with the highest rates of incarceration and of reoffending. As the quote mentioned, already marginalized communities are the ones that are disproportionately affected. The number of incarcerated individuals saw a boom after the 13th Amendment and has been rising at an even more alarming rate since the war on drugs began. If you haven't seen the 13th on Netflix, I highly recommend it to better understand how incarceration became slavery by another name and how the war on drugs has furthered that agenda. The final part of the exhibit gives a very simple statement where you take a chip and drop it into the category you feel fits you. The statement is, if I am arrested, I will be treated fairly. Something that is made clear to me again and again is that our current legal system is not created equally for everyone. While I am privileged enough to be able to drop my chip in the yes category, there are far too many people in this country who would have to drop their chip into no. At one point, our prison systems were much shorter and were focused on reform and reintroduction into society like it still is in other countries. Prisons are now for profit in this country, which does nothing but further add to the sheer volume of incarcerated individuals. So that was it for my little addition to my previous Alcatraz video. I learned a lot of new things, got to take a ton of pictures of my own, and even got to see that new exhibit that I didn't even know was there. Also on my trip to San Francisco, we went to the Winchester Mystery House, which I'll probably do a video on at some point, and we got to see the Golden Gate Bridge. We actually walked down about a mile from the visitor center to Fort Point, which is also another National Historic Site. I didn't take any pictures inside the fort, but I'll include a couple from online here so you can see what they look like. It was really cool to see the full intact fort and be able to walk all the way through it, up the stairs, and to the roof. Here are a few pictures of the Golden Gate Bridge on our walk down there. It was a beautiful day and was super clear. The walk to the fort, as well as on the roof of the fort, provided incredible views of the bridge. Also, here's a picture of a bird from Alcatraz that is not a pelican for which the island is named, but it is cute nonetheless. Thank you for joining me to take another look at Alcatraz. Sometimes you can only learn so much online, and the experiences and information you get in person are so much more. Well, that's it for today, and I hope you guys are all doing well. I'll catch you next time. Capone, lay down.